Hello and welcome to Gefet in the Daf. I'm Yael Shimoni, bringing to you together with Hadran and Yeshivat Risha, learning Iyun in your Daf Yomi B'Kiyut. And today we're in a new parak, and we just started a new parak, Avodah Zarah, and we'll be talking about Daf Samech Gimel. But actually, as you will see, we will take through Tosfot a jump and a leap to a whole different area, not what we're talking about here in this Gemara. The Gemara is going to discuss an issue about kinyan, about how do we acquire. And it will be swollen up in a very specific atmosphere, a little triggery also. We'll see how it evolves in the Gemara. What we'll be learning about today is not this topic, but a bigger topic that the Rishonim look at this sugya and in that perspective understand the whole story of requirement and regarding the very big machloket, very famous machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, how do we acquire? Usually we learn this machloket regarding Israelites, regarding Jews. But what we'll see today is that Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish also have a lot to say about how do Gentiles acquire. And to understand why that is so important, let's just begin with an overview so we can really fall into the iyun a little easier. Okay, so according to the Torah law, currency affects the kinyan. This is the dea of Rabbi Yochanan. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, Resh Lakish will be cholek, you'll see very, very soon. When a Jew gives money to a different person wanting to acquire something, at that moment, that object becomes his. Why is that so important? Let me just give you a story that a student of mine told me this year that helps us understand why is it so important to understand the exact moment that something becomes yours. She told me this tale that two people, let's say Reuven and Shimon, this is a real story, were bargaining over selling a car. And Reuven wanted to sell his car and Shimon wanted to buy it. So Shimon went and he saw the car was in the parking lot, and then they said, okay, great, Shimon wants to buy Reuven's car. They shook hands, and then they walked in to sign the contract. What happened in the meantime? There was an alarm, and a missile fell, and the car was severely damaged. Now the question is, whose car is it? Is it Reuven's car, or is it Shimon's car? Now, if it's Reuven's car, so Reuven has to call the government and say, listen, my car has been damaged. Can I get a payment from the government? But if it's Shimon's car, so he needs to go and talk to the government. And how do we know? So it sounds as if the shaking of the hands is not the moment, even though there was an agreement there that the car will change places, but only the signing of the contract is the real moment that Shimon would acquire the car. And that's why, even though they shook hands and decided that the car is Shimon's, it's still not really his until the contract was signed. So that's just to give us an understanding why the exact moment of acquirement has to be fully clear, because otherwise we get into a lot of these problems. And as we see, our sugya really deals with a similar problem. Not our sugya, the sugya of Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish that's in the background of the sugya. So, as I said, according to Torah law, currency affects the kinyan. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Let's see what Resh Lakish thinks. So, again, before we'll go back to our daf in Avodah Zarah Mem Zayin, in Avodah Zarah Samech Gimel, let's look at Baba Metzia Mem Zayin. Some of you have learned it, but we'll repeat it, of course. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Dvar Torah Ma'ot Konot. As we said, currency is what determines ownership, according to Rabbi Yochanan. But continues Rabbi Yochanan and says, "U'mipnei ma amru meshicha kona, gzera shema yomru lo nisrefu chitecha ba'aliyah." So Rabbi Yochanan says, really, Jews, according to Torah law, we should acquire when we give currency. However, Chachamim decided that they will go against that and ignore that. We'll see how exactly later. And actually say that there's a different point when you become an owner. Not when you pay for the goods, but when you actually take the goods into your custody. Meshicha. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, mideoraita, it's currency. Miderabanan, it's meshicha. And why, says Rabbi Yochanan? Zera shema yomar lo nisrefu chitecha ba'aliyah. This is much the story of the car that I told you. Sometimes things happen. Missiles fall. Fire breaks out. So why, if these things happen, is it so important that the one who's in ownership is the one who actually holds the goods? Says the Gemara here. We won't go into it in depth right now, just to have it in the background. That if you own something but it's not in your custody, then if something happens to it, let's say it's there's fire approaching it, you don't have the same ability to protect it. And the person who's actually holding your goods is not the owner, so he won't take enough measurements to protect your stuff because it's not his. People protect their own stuff better than they protect other people's. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. If we use the Torah way, saying that when you pay currency, then that's the moment you become an owner, what will happen? There will be a difference between the one who's holding the object and the one who's the owner, and that will create a situation. And if that object is in jeopardy for any kind of reason, it won't be protected as well because the one who's holding it in his custody is not the one who's the owner, and he won't take care of it in the same way if it was yours and if it was his. And that's why Chachamim changed halacha from Dvar Torah to the Rabbanan. That's the shita of Rabbi Yochanan mideoraita ma'ot konot miderabanan meshicha kona. ויש לקיש is cholek, ויש לקיש אמר, משיכה מפורשת מן התורה. ויש לקיש says, no, holding custody, holding the object, taking it into your own custody, that is actually written in the Torah. It's a gzera katuv. Where is it written? Says the Gemara, אמר קרא, וכי תמכרו ממכר לעמיתך או קנו מיד עמיתך דבר הנקרא מיד ליד. Rish Lakish reads the pasuk in Parshat Behar that describes ona'ah, and there okano miyad amitecha, miyad, if you buy something from the hand of your friend, your amit, from the hand, meaning that you have to take it in your hand from his hand. That's how Rish Lakish reads the pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan is cholek, he reads the pasuk differently. Bottom line, the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, according to Rish Lakish, Meshicha, taking the object into your custody, that is midoraita. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's only the Rabbanan. Midoraita is currency. Midorabanan, Chachamim did this. Okay, now after we saw this in the background, there is a very big question still lying around. Let's go back to that Gemara in Daf Mem Zayin. Again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Dvar Torah Ma'ot Konot. Rabbi Yochanan says, midoraita, currency buys. And Rish Lakish says, Meshicha. Now, Rish Lakish had a pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan does not have a pasuk. So, if Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have a pasuk, how does he know that currency is what determines ownership from the Raisa? If there's no pasuk, maybe it's a savara. We don't know. It's not written in the Gemara. So that is part of what we'll try to learn today when we'll see a bigger scope of the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So up till now, we only saw the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish regarding Jews. Jews, according to Rabbi Yochanan, they acquire using currency. And according to Rish Lakish, they acquire when they actually take the object into their custody. And Rish Lakish has a pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have a pasuk. And the Savara was not stated in the Gemara. So now, let's continue and see what happens in our sugya back to Avodah Zarah. Okay, hold this in your mind as we travel into the new sugya. So as I said, our sugya will deal with ownership regarding two different topics. One easier to handle and the other pretty triggering. Okay, the easier part emotionally is Perot Shvi'it. When we're in Shnat Shemitah, so you're not the owner of your land at the time of Shemitah, and therefore you're not the owner of the fruits and vegetables that you grow in your land, and you cannot also sell it as if you're an owner. You can only do other stuff with it. That was the daf before. And the sugya will discuss a different issue, the issue of etnan. Etnan is payment for buying sex, for a whore. That's a different issue of ownership. When is that considered payment? So how do these two things connect and how these connect to the bigger machlok we want to deal with? Let's go into Gemara. I'm starting in Daf Samech Bet Amud Bet. Okay. So the sugya starts this way. Devei Rabbi Yana yasfei perei shvi'it me'aniim upar'u lahem bashminit. So we see that a rabbi and his whole bite, his disciples, did something strange with the perot of Shnat Shemitah. And what they did is that they lended money for these perot, for these fruits and vegetables, and they took the fruits and vegetables and they only gave the money back on the 8th year. Now that sounds as if they're using these fruits and vegetables as if they're owners, and that's problematic because we said in Shmita you're not really the owner of the land, and that's why people went and told Rabbi Yochanan that they're doing something that they thought that was wrong. And then Rabbi Yochanan says, "Amar leho yehot hen avdin v'kenegdan be'etnan mutar." Rabbi Yochanan says, "No, it's fine what they're doing. They're allowed to lend money on these fruits." How do I know that, says Rabbi Yochanan? Because that is the law in Etnan, payment for sex, payment for a whore. What's allowed in Etnan? So in order to understand this, let's just review what Etnan is. And again, I'm saying this is triggery, but still we'll go through it because it will help us understand. And maybe at a different time we'll discuss the issue of how do we handle the fact that very triggery things happen in the Gemara, and still we have to learn from them other areas in Torah. So obviously this is not an easy thing in the sugya, but Bezrat Hashem we'll go through this and we'll find the time to talk about this more. So the Torah in the Dvarim says, "Etnan zona u'mechir lo tavi." Yeah, I want to read the pasuk together with you so it will be clear. לא תביא אתנן זונה ומחיר כלב בית אדוני אלוהיך לכל נדר, כי תועבת אדוני אלוהיך גם שניהם. The pasuk says, when you give payment for to a whore for sex, or if you exchange a dog for something else, you cannot bring that something else to Beit HaMikdash. It cannot become a neder, it cannot become a korban. So this is a very interesting statement in the Torah, and we won't go deeply into this. If Bezrat Hashem, we'll get to Masechet Tmura, and there in Masechet Tmura, the Mishnah discussed this. זהו אתנן, הוא אומר לזונה, הרי הלכת לזה בשכרך, אפילו 100, כולן אסורים, וכן הוא אומר לחברו, הרי הלכת לזה, ותלין שפחתך אצל עבדי, רבי אומר, אינו אתנן, חכמים אומרים אתנן. So wait till Masechet Tmura, and then you'll know more about that. So Rashi helps us understand the sugya that we were reading. Again, I'll remind you what the sugya said. People were saying that the Veda Rabbi Yana are doing something wrong with the fruits of Shvi'it. They come to Rabbi Yochanan and tell him, what's this? And Rabbi Yochanan says what they're doing is fine because I learned it from Etnan. Okay, so let's use Rashi and help us understand what happened. So Rashi says, what did the Rabbi Yana do? They yazfei perot shvi'it, they lended the fruits of shvi'it before the time that you are supposed to give them away to everybody. There's a certain point of the year where you have to let everybody take the fruits, and they actually lend it out before that time. And then parelo b'shminit, ashtakach de'ach le'aniyim b'shminit achre ha'bi'ur chalifei perei shvi'it. What happened is that poor people who took these fruits and vegetables were eating them after the time of the Shvi'it, after the Bi'ul. And this is problematic because at that point it was supposed to be allowed for everybody. How come it was only for the poor who lended money for this? Ye'oten avdinan, that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. כיוון דהי שעתה לא הבו הנח בהם, ולא החלופי הני בהני, לאו חליפינינו, ולא חיילה קדושת שביעית עליהם. So, let's explain. What we've learned in Adapim before is that perot shvi'it, if I give you perot shvi'it, fruits of shvi'it, and you give me money, So you have holy fruit and I have holy money because we exchanged the money with the fruit. And what we've learned is that Perot Shvi'it are also tofes. They also give their kedusha to the payment. So now you have two problems. You have fruits who are kadosh, and I have money which is kadosh. So here, the Ve'abianai are doing a problem. Why? Because they're lending money for fruits of Perot Shvi'it. So the loan seems to be also kadosh. And if you give money for these fruits, let's explain again. Then we have poor people. They go and they collect these fruits, and then they give them to the Vei Rabbiana, and the Vei Rabbiana give them a loan instead. So what happens? The Vei Rabbiana eat the fruit at the right time, but the poor people now have money that they'll use it later on when they're not allowed to use it anymore because this money is also kadosh b'kedushat shvit, and they were supposed to get rid of it already at the time of the bi'ul. So that causes a problem. How come they're lending them money, which will also be kadosh in the same kedusha? So says Rabbi Yochanan, don't worry, that's okay. Why? Because at the time that they were lending the money, the pirot were not bi'en. What does that mean? When you give a loan, you don't expect to get the money at that point, right? You're giving fruits and you're giving money in exchange, and you only have to return the money later on, much later on. You can use it later on also. So says Rabbi Yochanan, if the exchange was not exactly at that point giving fruits and then giving money and then using the money, if these things are separated, that's okay. Why? כנגדו באתנן, says רש"י, בא עליה ואחר כך נתן לה אתננה, מותר להקרבה. כיוון דבלאו בשעת ביאה יהיבני עלי, כי הדר יהיב להרות עליה מתנה בעלמא הוא. Rashi explains, the Brisa in the Gemara, the Brisa that Rabbi Yochanan is giving us to read, says that when somebody pays for a sexual act, but only does it later on, or if he had sex now and only later gave the money, so then the payment and the act are separated, and we view the payment as just a gift. It's not connected to the act. So the same thing here with Perot Shvi'it, we see the money as a gift, and we don't see it as an exchange for the fruit because it's given only later. So as we see, the Gemara moved from Perot Shvi'it to Etnan, and then in our daf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara zooms in on the issue of Etnan and asks a few questions in order to understand what that Baraita said. Okay, so again, hold on, this is triggery, we'll get through this. According to the Baraita that we learned in Daf Samech Bet Amud Bet, if somebody first had sex and then later gave the payment, that is not considered payment. It's not considered etnan, and it can be used for that money can be used to bring to Bet HaMikdash. So that's a quotation of the Brisa that we saw in the Daf Samech Bet Amud Bet. Continues the Gemara and asks, "Hu? We're asking from a different Brisa. בא עליה ואחר כך נתן לה, אפילו מכאן ועד 3 שנים, את נתנה אסור. According to this Tanaim, it looks as if it's contradictorily straightforward, because we said that if the payment is not at the time of the act, so it's not etnan, and according to this, it is, even if it's 3 years later. So how do we solve this contradiction? It's classic Minhu. אמר רבי נחמן בר יצחק אמר רב חיסדא לא קשיא. דאמר התבעלי לי בתלה זה, דאמר לה התבעלי לי בתלה סתם. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says each Tana is talking about a different situation. When do we say that this is etnan, even if it happened 3 years later? If he promised the whore a specific object, if he's saying this will be your payment, giving a specific object, then that object is already named, and even if it will be given 3 years later, it's already considered payment for the sexual act. But if he said, I will pay you some kind of object that we all know is here the story is tale, okay? If I promise you a lamb, so if I say I'll give you a lamb, or if I'm saying I'll give you this specific lamb, it's a different story. If I'm saying I'll give you a lamb in general, so I didn't actually point at a specific object, therefore I can give it later and it will not be considered as payment for the act. However, if I said this specific object will be your payment, even if I give it 3 years later, that is also asur b'isur etnan. So that's how Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says that Rav Chisda solved the problem between these two brisos. And then the Gemara asks a question that is where the Tosfot and Rashi deal with the issue of acquirement. And this is really where I wanted us to be headed. So tune in. Okay, I hope you're with me. Ready? Let's go. The Gemara asks, okay, even if somebody said this specific object, this specific lamb, still, how is that etnan? How come this bichlal is considered as if the whore acquired it? Remember what we learned before? We learned before that Jews can only become owners of something if they actually took the object into their custody. Now here, somebody promised somebody else a lamb. That's true. Even he said a specific lamb. Maybe that lamb has a name. Maybe that lamb is Joe the lamb. Fine. We know who the lamb is. We have a picture of it. It doesn't matter. The other person didn't become the owner. He'll only become the owner if he actually took it into his custody. So how come the Tanaim say that if somebody promised something specific, it's already asur b'isur etnan? We have different laws for acquirement. Promising a specific object is not one of any way of acquiring something, right? Okay. Now, if we would think that giving currency is a way of requirement, we would say that you are the owner. Why? Because if we said, for a sexual act, you will get this lamb once the act is done, so that's paying for the lamb, then you're already in custody of the lamb. That is true if we would be going according to Torah laws. But according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, it's not an option for Jews. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, there is a Gzera D'Rabbanan, and it's only when we take it into our custody. And according to Reish Lakish, it's midaraita that way. So how could it be that the Tanaim are talking about a lamb that has not been acquired as if it has been acquired? Says the Gemara, the Gemara says, well, we're not talking about a Jew. We're talking about a whore that is non-Jewish. And she acquires when she gives the payment, when the sexual act has been done. Continues the Gemara and says, if you don't want it to be a non-Jewish whore, we want her to be Jewish, leolam bezona Israelit, v'kegon dechai b'chatzera. There's a different kinyan chatzer. If somebody puts something in my house, then it becomes mine. So if it's a Jew, that's what the Bright Side is talking about. And if it's a Gentile, the Bright Side is written just the way it is. Okay, so what happened in the sugya? We discovered that it's true that Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish in Baba Metzia talked about the fact that only putting something in your custody makes you an owner. However, it looks in this Gemara that this is true only for Jews, and for Gentiles, it's a totally different story. So what is the Gemara talking about? Let's look at Rashi. Rashi here explains to us why non-Jews buy things in a different way. So let's read Rashi's explanation. Oved Kochavim. Okay, Rashi here explains why is it different for Gentiles. Oved Kochavim lav bar meshicha, dechiktive meshicha b'Yisrael ktiva, o kano miyad amitecha. So Rashi here explains and says, well, In the Torah, it says that Jews acquire when they put something in their custody, because that's what's written in the pasuk. Okano miyad amitecha. Amitecha means it has to be another Jew, and if somebody is a Gentile, he acquires in a different way. So, if you remember what we learned before, Rashi here is actually quoting Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was the one who said that this is written in the Torah, and indeed, if it's written in the Torah and the pasuk says amitecha, it means it's only for Jews. So, according to Rashi, it looks as if our whole sugya is according to Reish Lakish, because who says that that's what Rabbi Yochanan thinks? Rabbi Yochanan did not have a pasuk. Rabbi Yochanan, it seemed, had a savara, and if it's a savara, it shouldn't be different between Jews and Gentiles. That's what I would think. That's what I would think if I would be reading Rashi, and I would know the sugya from Daf Mem Zayin. So let's look at Tosfot, and we'll see how Tosfot reads, and he has a different reading. And again, according to Rashi, this whole sugya is by Reish Lakish. Just to mention, the fact that Rashi says this here is surprising, because Reish Lakish was not pasking in halacha. Rabbi Yochanan was the one who was pasking to halacha, and this sugya is written already many years later, and it is fascinating to find a sugya that is according to Reish Lakish, even though he is not being pasking to halacha. And it's surprising. I would expect the sugya at least to speak in two voices, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and not only to speak in the voice of Reish Lakish, but in any rate, that's what it seems that Rashi thinks when he reads the sugya. So, according to what Rashi said, is Reish Lakish thinks that Gentiles buy when they use currency, right? It seems as if Reish Lakish here switched and became Rabbi Yochanan once it became non-Jews. So where does this come from? If you look at the side of the Gemara, you'll see that Masoret HaShas tells you you have to go and learn another sugya to understand what's going on here. Go learn Masechet Bechorot Daf Yud Gimel. And again, we're approaching that soon, but let's just see what's written there. אמר רבי יצחק בר נחמני, אמר ריש לקיש משום רבי יושעיה, ישראל שנתן מעות לעובד כוכבים בבהמתו בדיניהם, אף על פי שלא משך, קנה, וחייבת בבכורה. So here we see that Reish Lakish says it very clearly, that if you're a non-Jew, you buy using currency, and not by acquirement. So we see that Reish Lakish here agrees with Rabbi Yochanan when it comes to Gentiles. Jews, he says, is a gzera katuv, but according to Gentiles, they indeed use currency. Now, what does Rabbi Yochanan think about all of this? We only heard him about Jews, right? So Tosfot here explains to us and fills us in what happens in the Gemara and Bechorot in the other page, and says that Rabbi Yochanan is also the exact opposite of Reish Lakish when it comes to Gentiles. Let's see. Says the Tosfot, Veha mechasra meshicha. פירוש, ואפילו לרבי יוחנן דאמר דבר תורה מעות קונות, אך אגבי אתנן לא קנו, כיוון שהפקיעו חכמים דאין קניית מעות קונה והוא כמו המשיכה, גם ממנה הפקיעו ואין כאן אתנן כלל. So first the Tosfot says, you have to understand that this sugya is also according to Rabbi Yochanan. And Tosfot says, don't worry, I'll read the entire sugya for you in the eyes of Rabbi Yochanan. So if we try to read the sugya in the eyes of Rabbi Yochanan, first we have to explain why, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if a Jewish whore gave currency for the lamb, why isn't it hers already? Because Rabbi Yochanan says that midoraita, it is hers. So maybe midoraita, it's already asur. It's true, Takanat de Rabbanan changed it, but there's a din doraita in the background. So here first, Tosfot says, you have to understand, when Rabbi Yochanan said that there was a Takanat de Rabbanan, he didn't mean that Chachamim added another way of acquirement and the basic way is still existing. When Chachamim said that currency is not used, they mean that there is no din d'oraita anymore. They actually destroyed the din d'oraita. כיוון שהפקיעו חכמים ואין קניית מעות קונה והוא כמו המשיכה, גם ממנה הפקיעו ואין כאן אתנן כלל. So that's the first really important thing that Tosfot says about Rabbi Yochanan, and this is not trivial. We won't go into this further, just remember that. Continues the Tosfot in the next Dibur Matchil and says, בזונה עובדת כוכבים לא קניה במשיכה וכריש לקיש משעני, ואמר לעמיתך במשיכה לעובד כוכבים בכסף. So here he agrees with Rashi and he says it's true. When the Gemara said the Okimta that it's talking about non-Jewish war, it's only according to Reish Lakish. So what happened to Rabbi Yochanan? Continues the Tosfot and says, דאילו לרבי יוחנן איתלי לעובד כוכבים במשיכה. ומשום דרב חיסדא איתלי בפרק הזהב, כי רבי יוחנן הדר משנה שינוי אחרין, אלא לרבי יוחנן לא תקשה. Says Tosfot, you have to read the sugya carefully. Remember, there were two okimtot in the sugya. First okimta, we're talking about a non-Jewish person. Second okimta, we're talking about a Jew, but kinyan chatzir. Says the Tosfot, why was it so important for the sugya to give two different explanations for the okimta? Why did they have to bring kinyan chatzir? Says the Tosfot, because they wanted the sugya to work also according to Rabbi Yochanan. And why was that so important for the sugya? Because the sugya is in the name of Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda is posek Rabbi Yochanan in Daf Mem Zayin Amud Bet in Baba Metzia. So it's not true that Rashi read this entire sugya in the eyes of Rish Lakish. No, if you read the sugya carefully, you will see Rabbi Yochanan hiding there just as well. So let's sum up what the Tosfot said. First, the sugya is not only according to Reish Lakish, it's also understood according to Rabbi Yochanan. It looks as if there's some machloket between Rashi and Tosfot. Second, according to Rabbi Yochanan, when Chazal did this takana and said that currency doesn't work for Jews anymore, you have to use custody, they actually totally destroyed the Din Torah and didn't leave it there at all. And according to Tosfot, Rabbi Yochanan is also cholek on Reish Lakish when it comes to Gentiles in Mashiach. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Gentiles can acquire, according to Reish Lakish, Gentiles can acquire according to currency. But according to the position of Rabbi Yochanan, the law is reversed for Gentiles who are acquiring via Mashiach, even according to Torah law. So now we have a new machloket. We have Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish cholek in two ways. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Jews acquire by currency and Gentiles acquire by Mashiach. And according to Reish Lakish, Jews acquire by Mashiach and Gentiles acquire by currency. So here we have a very, very interesting topic to deal with. Why would there be such a big difference between Jews and Gentiles when it comes to the original way of acquirement? So here I have for you a perush of Rashar Hirsch on the Torah dealing with this question. This is a big question, a big unique question. There were many answers given to this, but the text of Rashar Hirsch is very interesting, and I'll sum it up for you. And those of you who want are welcome to read it inside. So first, the Rashar Hirsch begins and says, as we said now, the Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are cholek on both levels. Again, Rabbi Yochanan thinks Jews acquire by currency. Reish Lakish says, no, Jews acquire by Mashiach. And Gentiles, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Gentiles acquire by Mashiach. And according to Reish Lakish, Gentiles acquire by currency. So why? What does this mean? So starts Rashar Hirsch and he says, okay, in order to solve this puzzle and understand this machloket, you have to go back to understand how ownership works at all. And says to Rashar Hirsch, I think that ownership became about from the word v'kivshuha in Sefer Bereshis. Because God at the creation of the world, for the first man, said, says Rashar Hirsch, what does it mean v'kivshuha? V'kivshuha means take over. That is the original way of how people acquire things. That's the ancient way of acquirement, to take over. Now, that is when you're one man in the world and the whole world is about you. There's nobody else but you, and nobody else is the owner. So whatever you take into your custody becomes yours. What happens when there's another human being involved and now you want his goods? So here says the Rashar Hirsch, something changed, because when I'm looking at the world, I don't have to ask anybody's permission. I just take for myself. If I see a fruit on a tree, I just take it and it's mine. But if the fruit is in your hands, I have to ask for your permission. And only when you agree and you give me the fruit, then it becomes mine. So that's what changed after other people came into the world. Still, the basic thing remained. You have to take something in order for it to be yours. But what changed? When there's another human being, the agreement. So when I'm dealing with the world, I don't need an agreement. I just need to take over. When I'm dealing with somebody else, I first have to ask for permission. When the permission is given, then I need to acquire it to myself. So that's the beginning. And now we can understand the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. So says the Rashar Hirsch, אם איננו טועים, הראשיתה זו באה להבליט את ההבדל שבין שני התחומים השונים עקרונית, בין תחום הטבע, שבו האדם מתייחס אל החפצים, לבין זירת המשפט, הקובעת את היחס שבין אדם לחברו. Says the Rashar Hirsch, all I explained up to now works very well with Rish Lakish, but Rabbi Yochanan, he thinks that when Torah came about, it came to make a big difference, a huge difference, between somebody that approaches nature and somebody that approaches another human being. According to Reish Lakish, it remains basically the same thing. The only difference is I need to have your agreement, right? But according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Torah gave us a new law and says you have to see this whole story of acquiring totally different when you're facing another human being. When you're facing another human being, there, says Reish Lakish, בתחום היחסים בין אדם לחברו, רק הזכות היא מקור לבעלות. When you say that currency is what changes ownership, you actually are saying that we no longer take any interest in who's holding this. The only interest is, did the other side agree? And how do we know if the other side agreed? If he got something in return, then we know he agreed. So saying that acquirement goes only according to currency, that's actually saying when I have another person involved, I'm no longer interested in who's holding the object. I'm only interested in whether or not there was an agreement. So this is the source of the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish according to Rashar Hirsch. And let's sum up everything that we've seen in this machloket. So how do we read her? Sugya, according to Rashi, the Sugya is only according to Rish Lakish, and according to Tosfot, the Sugya is also according to Rabbi Yochanan. The machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's a savara behind the fact that you have to use currency in order to change ownership, and only midirabanan there was a change. And according to Reish Lakish, there's a gzerat katuv. We were missing in understanding what is the savara and why did the savara switch between Gentiles and Jews. So after we read the Rashar Hirsch, we saw that the Rashar Hirsch said, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Torah came about and told Jews, listen, we want you to forget about the fact that you took over something. That's of no interest when you're dealing with another human being. There only his agreement is what matters. So that's what the Torah told Jews. But to Gentiles, they don't have this big difference between nature and another person, because still the most important deed is whether or not you're in control of the object. And that's the big difference between Jews and Gentiles. That for Jews, the Torah took them one step forward and said, we don't want you to care about violence, holding something physically. We want you to move to a total spiritual understanding of ownership, that is involving only around the other side's willingness to allow you to use the object, and you know that he's willing when you've given him something in return. So now we understand the savara of Rabbi Yochanan according to Rashar Hirsch and why it would be different between Jews and Gentiles. Because the Torah wanted Jews to go to a higher level and didn't actually ask that from Gentiles. Now what's so very interesting in what Rabbi Yochanan says according to the Rashar Hirsch is that's what the Torah originally wanted from Jews. But unfortunately, reality shows us that in order for that to happen, you have to care for the other person's objects just as much as you care for your own. And since that's not the case, because people don't take care of what's not theirs at the same way that they take care of what's theirs, so Chachamim came and said, well, we have to take the Jews and bring them back to the same way as Gentiles. Also, they will be buying the Mashiach. So that's what we've seen today. again, we started from this sugya, which is not easy to handle. But really, what was most important for me is for you to learn about this machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, and that you should know this interesting commentary and explanation of Rashar Hirsch of the day of Rabbi Yochanan that Tosfot showed us in the sugya, that the Torah wanted us to leave any understanding of ownership regarding who's holding it, but actually Chachamim said, well, that's too hard for you. Let's go back to the original in the sense of before Matan Torah. And still, the one who holds is the one who's the owner, and not when payment has been made. So I hope these are sugyot that are very, very difficult. I think very intriguing. And I hope I've given you a different way to look at the sugya through Rashi and Tosfot. And B'ezrat Hashem, we'll be learning Tmura and Bechorot, so we'll see these things again later. Okay, so take care, and we'll meet again soon.